Hello everyone. In this video lecture we are going to cover all the structures present in the hind brain. We are going to cover the anatomy of hind brain in case of animals. Now hind brain comprises of cerebellum. Now where this cerebellum is present? It is present in the dorsal end. If this is the head of the animal, it would be in that particular position. So this would be a dorsal or posterior. In the posterior surface of brain you will find cerebellum, and in the anterior surface you will find two more structures, that are pons and medulla. So this is the pons region below the midbrain, and this is the medulla region above the spinal cord. So these three structures comprises the hind brain. So this is the hind region of the brain or caudal region in case of animals. So cerebellum, pons and medulla, they all comprises the hind brain. Now let me discuss the anatomy of each particular structure in detail. Now let me come to the cerebellum first. Now cerebellum, where this cerebellum is present, you can see it is present in the posterior side, posterior inferior side, or we can say posterior lower side of brain. So cerebellum has these gyri, elevations and sulci more prominent. So gyri and sulci are more prominent in case of cerebellum, because they are giving more spaces to neuron. And if we cut the cross section of cerebellum, you will find these white matter like flowers. These structures are, this structure which is like a tree is known as arbor vitae. Which thing? Arbor vitae. Now let me tell you some salient features of cerebellum. Cerebellum is the largest part of hind brain, not of the brain but hind brain. The largest part of the brain is cerebrum, but the largest part of hind brain is cerebellum. It is located in posterior cranial fossa, and it is the posterior cranial fossa behind the pons and medulla. These are the pons and this is medulla, and it is present behind the pons and medulla. Now what are the structures which are present in the cerebellum? If you will see in the cross section, so the structure of cerebellum which is on the upper surface is known as anterior lobe, and the structure which is on the lower surface is the posterior lobe. And there is another structure which is present towards the medulla and pons, that is flocculonodular lobe. So there are basically three lobes of cerebellum. The first one is anterior lobe, the second one is posterior lobe, and the third one is the flocculonodular lobe. This anterior lobe and posterior lobe are separated by a long sulcus which is known as primary fissure or fissure prima. Now this flocculonodular lobe is separated by other structures of cerebellum by posterolateral fissure. Now as we can see, what is this transverse fissure? Transverse fissure is nothing but it divides the cerebellum from cerebrum. Like this region is the cerebrum and this is the cerebellum. So this fissure here, transverse fissure, divides the cerebellum from cerebrum, and in this transverse fissure there is a structure of dura mater which get inserted, and that structure of dura mater is known as tentorium cerebelli. Which thing? Tentorium cerebelli. As I discussed, this was the anterior lobe and this is the posterior lobe. Anterior and posterior lobe are separated by fissure prima or primary fissure. This is the flocculonodular lobe which is separated from whole cerebellum by posterolateral fissure, flocculonodular lobe. Now, what are the functions of the cerebellum? Besides, we are studying anatomy of the cerebellum, but we should know about the functions also, na? So that there are three major functions of cerebellum. First is maintaining the equilibrium. So our body needs to be in a state of equilibrium. Means the functions associated to movement, to various cycle should be coordinated in such a way that our homeostasis should be in a properly well defined manner, so that an animal would get sufficient life sustaining properties. So what this cerebellum do? It maintains this equilibrium. Secondly, it regulates the muscle tone, the contraction, the relaxation of the muscles, and it also is responsible for coordinating the somatic motor activities, like our movement is also coordinated by the cerebellum. Balance of the body, specialized movements, like somebody is good in gymnastics, so that particular area is controlled out by the cerebellum. Now if we will see, cerebellum in its, if we will take out the cerebellum from the brain, so how it looks like, in the center we have a ridge like thing that is known as cerebral vermis, and lateral to this cerebral vermis we would be having some hemispheres like kind of a thing, and those hemispheres are nothing but cerebral hemispheres. So we can see, or we can say that cerebral hemispheres, two cerebral hemispheres are divided by this cerebral vermis, and in the lower region we would be having this flocculonodular lobe. So you can see also here, this is the vermis. These are nothing but cerebral hemisphere. This was the primary fissure which was dividing anterior and posterior lobe. Now let me come to the other things which are important. Like, let me tell you about the fissures. First was fissure prima. It divides cerebellum into anterior and posterior lobe. This is red one is the anterior lobe, and this greenish one is posterior lobe. So this is fissure prima. Now there is another fissure, horizontal fissure. This form a junction between superior and inferior surface. If you will look closely, this is the inferior surface of the cerebellum, and this inner one would be the superior. This would be the superior surface, and this would be the inferior surface of cerebellum. This superior surface of cerebellum and inferior surface of cerebellum is separated by a fissure which you can see here, and this fissure is nothing but horizontal fissure. Now you will tell me why it is known as horizontal, because during embryonic development of the CNS, the baby is in the horizontal position. That's why this particular fissure, which is looking here vertical, but it is known as horizontal. Okay. Now lastly we have this posterior lateral fissure, as I discussed two times before this, that it is present between the flocculonodular lobe and other parts of cerebellum. Like, this is the flocculonodular lobe, and other parts of cerebellum is separated by this posterior lateral fissure. Now functionally speaking about the cerebellum, it is having three structures, or we can say functionally, if we divide cerebellum, then we would be getting three things. The first is archae cerebellum. Archae means it is the oldest part of the cerebellum. In case of which thing? Evolutionary phase. It is the vestibular cerebellum, because it is connected with the vestibular apparatus. First, it is first formed. In cerebellum, the first structure formed is the flocculonodular lobe or archae cerebellum. What this archae cerebellum do? It maintains balance and tones of muscles. Like, balancing of body and muscle tone is maintained or coordinated by which part of cerebellum? Archae cerebellum. And archae cerebellum is nothing but flocculonodular lobe present in the inferior surface of the brain. Okay. Now we have, where is this flocculonodular lobe? This bluish portion is flocculonodular lobe or archae cerebellum. Now we are having paleo-cerebellum. Why it is known as paleo-cerebellum? Because there are certain spinal nerves which are connected by this region of the cerebellum. That's why paleo-cerebellum is also known as spinal cerebellum. It controls simple movements of upper limb. The upper limb, like animals, upper limb, the movements done by the upper limbs of animals are generally coordinated by which part of the cerebellum? Paleo-cerebellum. And there are certain spinal nerves associated with this region also. And where in this diagram we can find this paleo-cerebellum? So paleo-cerebellum is this region. This and this region is paleo-cerebellum. You can see this is the paleo-cerebellum, which is responsible for the upper limb movement. Now we have neocerebellum. It is newly formed, like the cerebral hemisphere. So these are the cerebral hemispheres. So they comprises which thing? Neocerebellum. Now the skilled voluntary movements of like I said about gymnastics, so that are carried out by the neocerebellum. So these were the three functional divisions: archae cerebellum, paleo-cerebellum, and neocerebellum. Okay. Now if I will talk, this cerebellum is connected with midbrain, pons, and medulla by some specialized neuronal fibers, and these specialized neuronal fibers are known as cerebellar peduncles. The cerebellar peduncles which connect cerebellum with midbrain is known as superior cerebellar peduncle, and the cerebellar peduncle which connects midbrain with the pons varolii is known as middle cerebellar peduncle or branchium pontis, and this inferior cerebellar peduncle connects cerebellum with medulla, and it also arises from the restiformis body of medulla oblongata, which we will study after this particular cerebellum. Now, talking about the cerebral cortex, the outer thicker layer of cerebral cortex comprises nothing but a molecular layer, the outer molecular layer, there's Purkinje layer, and finally granular layer. So this was all about the cerebellum anatomy. Okay, Hope you got it. Now let me come to the pons varoli. Now how pons varoli look alike and where it is present? It is present behind the midbrain and above the medulla oblongata. This region is nothing but pons varoli. Pons varoli. Why it is named pons? Firstly, why we call pons as pons? Because it is bridge between two cerebral hemispheres. Like these are the, like I said about the cerebral hemispheres, these are the two cerebral hemispheres. So these two cerebral hemispheres in the posterior end have a bridge that is nothing but pons varoli. Okay, that's why it is known as pons. Now this is the pons region. You can see in the brain, this is the pons region anterior to the cerebellum. This is the fourth ventricle. So it also forms some part of fourth ventricle. So it is below midbrain and above medulla and anterior or in front to the cerebellum. Like this is the midbrain, so pons is below midbrain, and this is medulla, so pons is above medulla. This is cerebellum, so pons is in front of the cerebellum. Clear? Now why pons is named so? Because it forms a bridge between two cerebellar hemispheres. And in cerebellum, or we can in pons, we have a basilar groove. Through this basilar groove, a basilar artery flows, which provides blood to various parts of the brain. Now, if we will talk about the side view of pons, the cranial end have a basal pons, which is known as basilar part, and the caudal end has this part, which is known as tegmental part, which arises directly from the tegmentum of midbrain. Okay. So we have in side view, we would be finding two structures, base and tegmentum, as I showed you in diagram. I have told you guys many times that this anatomy is a subject which you have to memorize via pictures. You can't understand it with the writings or books. You have to understand it with the diagrams, with the flow charts, with the notes, short notes, and with the most importantly pictures. That's why in my notes you will find there are more pictures than writings. Okay, so transversely, or we can say side view, if we will talk about a side view of pons, you would be finding basilar part, this part, basilar part, which is anterior part, and it is continuation of inferior pyramid. Now you will tell me what are these inferior pyramids. See, in when we will study medulla na, so medulla on its ventral side has this inferior median fissure. Side to these inferior median fissures, or we can say lateral to these inferior median fissures, there are some elevated areas which are known as pyramids, superior or inferior pyramids. So in the ventral surface we would be having inferior pyramids, and this basilar part is nothing but the continuation of inferior pyramids of medulla oblongata in its inferior or ventral surface. It forms middle cerebral peduncles. Now what it means? It means that the middle cerebral peduncles, or we can say the brachium pontis, is generally found by the basilar part. Now in case of tegmental part, it is posterior part. Like I showed you here, this is the posterior part. So it is tegmental part. It is continuation of medullary tegmentum. Like medulla also has tegmentum, or midbrain also has a tegmentum. So tegmentum from midbrain continues towards the pons, and it makes the tegmentum of pons also. And this basilar part is having a similar thickness, but this tegmental part has a varying thickness. If we will cut a cross section, you can see this particular part is nothing but which thing? It is basilar part, and posterior to it we would be having which part? Tegmental part. This basilar part and tegmental part of pons are separated by corpus trapezoidum, and this basilar part has certain nuclei, a group of cell bodies like nuclei pontis, which is the gray matter of basilar part. What is the gray matter of basilar part? Nuclei pontis, and it makes cortico links between cerebrum and brainstem. Now finally let me come to the medulla oblongata. Like you can see in the ventral surface of the brain, we would be having this inferior median fissure. These are inferior pyramids. Then we have some elevated bodies, oleus. Then we have restiformis body. Okay, this is the posterior surface. Medulla is just 3 centimeter long, but it controls almost all the involuntary functions of the body. Okay, so you can see where we can locate the medulla. This is the medulla. So medulla is above the spinal cord and below the pons and in front of the cerebellum or lower fourth ventricle. Okay, so the medulla is separated by the spinal cord, as medulla is nothing but it is continuation of spinal cord. So medulla is separated from the spinal cord by this foramen, which is present in the skull of animal, that is known as foramen magnum. Okay, Now, if we will see about the dorsal and ventral surface of medulla, what we can see, this is nothing but superior median fissure. These tubercles are known as gracile tubercle. Lateral to superior median fissure are gracile tubercle, and lateral to this gracile tubercle we would be having cunate tubercle. With tubercle, cunate tubercle. And if we will see anterior to this particular region, we would be having a vagal triangle. This is the vagal triangle, and above to this vagal triangle there is also small triangle known as hypoglossal triangle. Okay, then anterior to that we having vestibular area, then we having four flora, fourth ventricle. So this all comprises medulla oblongata in the dorsal structure, and as I told, in the ventral structure this is inferior median fissure, then inferior pyramids, then olive, and finally which thing, rustiformis body. So junction between medulla and spinal cord is nothing but foramen magnum. So this was all about the medulla anatomy. This was the anatomy of medulla oblongata. So this was all about the medulla oblongata, pons, and cerebellum, or in crux we completed whole brain. Hind brain is completed in this video, and there are two more lectures on midbrain and hindbrain. Thanks.